It is the heart of every person to know the history of his country. But from where does he know the history things? This channel is giving you a chance to know the history of your country, as well as other countries, gives an opportunity to go through the history. So subscribe to Know Your World channel. On this channel, we will know the history of everyone in order from A to Z. Today we will see about Buddhism religion. Narrative that spans over 2500 years. It originated in ancient India and has since spread across Asia and, eventually, to other parts of the world. Here is a condensed overview of the history of Buddhism. Buddhism, also known as Buddha Dharma and Dharma Vinaya, Transal. Doctrines and disciplines, is an Indian religion or philosophical tradition based on teachings attributed to the Buddha. It originated in the eastern Gangetic Plain as a Sramana movement in the 5th century BCE, and gradually spread throughout much of Asia via the Silk Road. It is the world's 4th largest religion, with over 520 million followers, Buddhists, who comprise 7% of the global population. The Buddha's central teachings emphasize the aim of attaining liberation from the dissatisfaction or unease, dukkha, that arises with attachment or clinging to impermanent, anitya, states and things, which lack a lasting essence, anatman. He endorsed the middle way, a path of mental development that avoids both extreme asceticism and hedonism. A summary of this path is expressed in the Noble Eightfold Path. A cultivation of the mind through observance of meditation and Buddhist ethics. Other widely observed practices include monasticism, taking refuge in the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and the cultivation of perfections, paramita. Buddhist schools vary in their interpretation of the paths to liberation, marga, as well as the relative importance and canonicity assigned to various Buddhist texts, and their specific teachings and practices. Two major extant branches of Buddhism are generally recognized by scholars: Theravada, lit. School of the Elders, and Mahayana, lit. Great Vehicle. The Theravada tradition emphasizes the attainment of nirvana, lit. Extinguishing, as a means of transcending the individual self and ending the cycle of death and rebirth, samsara. While the Mahayana tradition emphasizes the bodhisattva ideal, in which one works for the liberation of all beings. The Buddhist canon is vast, with many different textual collections in different languages, such as Sanskrit, Pali, Tibetan, and Chinese. The Theravada branch has a widespread following in Sri Lanka as well as in Southeast Asia, namely Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. The Mahayana branch, which includes the traditions of Zen, Pure Land, Nichiren, Tiantai, Tendai, and Shingon, is predominantly practiced in Nepal, Bhutan, China, Malaysia, Vietnam, Taiwan, Korea, and Japan. Additionally, Vajrayana, lit. Indestructible Vehicle, a body of teachings attributed to Indian adepts, may be viewed as a separate branch or tradition within Mahayana. Tibetan Buddhism, which preserves the Vajrayana teachings of 8th century India, is practiced in the Himalayan states as well as in Mongolia and Russian Kalmykia, historically, until the early 2nd millennium. Buddhism was widely practiced in the Indian subcontinent. It also had a foothold to some extent elsewhere in Asia, namely Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. The life of Siddhartha Gautam, 563–483 B.C.A. Buddhism began with the life of Siddhartha Gautam, also known as the Buddha, meaning enlightened one. He was born in Lumbini, Nepal, into a privileged family. At the age of 29, he renounced his princely life in search of spiritual truth. After years of meditation and contemplation, he attained enlightenment under a Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya, India. Teaching and spread, 5th century BCE, after achieving enlightenment. The Buddha began teaching the Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering, the cause of suffering, the end of suffering, and the path to the end of suffering, and the Eightfold Path to liberation. His teachings attracted followers, and Buddhism began to spread across India. Early Buddhist councils, 5th to 4th century BCE, after the Buddha's passing. His teachings were orally transmitted by his disciples. Several Buddhist councils were held to preserve and codify these teachings. The first council took place shortly after his death in Rajagaha. Divergence into Buddhist schools, 3rd century BCE. Over time, Buddhism split into various schools, the two most prominent being Theravada, the Way of the Elders, and Mahayana, the Great Vehicle. Theravada emphasized the original teachings of the Buddha, while Mahayana developed new texts and placed greater emphasis on compassion and the Bodhisattva ideal. Historical roots. Historically, the roots of Buddhism lie in the religious thought of Iron Age India around the middle of the first millennium BCE. This was a period of great intellectual ferment and socio-cultural change known as the Second Urbanization, marked by the growth of towns and trade. The composition of the Upanishads and the historical emergence of the Sramana traditions. New ideas developed both in the Vedic tradition in the form of the Upanishads and outside of the Vedic tradition through the Sramana movements. The term Sramana refers to several Indian religious movements parallel to but separate from the historical Vedic religion, including Buddhism, Jainism and others such as Ajivika. Several Sramana movements are known to have existed in India before the 6th century BCE, pre-Buddha, pre-Mahavira. And these influenced both the Astika and Nastika traditions of Indian philosophy. According to Martin Wilshire, the Sramana tradition evolved in India over two phases, namely Paccekabuddha and Savaka phases, the former being the tradition of individual ascetic and the latter of disciples, and that Buddhism and Jainism ultimately emerged from these. Brahmanical and non-Brahmanical ascetic groups shared and used several similar ideas, but the Sramana traditions also drew upon already established Brahmanical concepts and philosophical roots, states Wiltshire, to formulate their own doctrines. Brahmanical motifs can be found in the oldest Buddhist texts, using them to introduce and explain Buddhist ideas. For example, prior to Buddhist developments, the Brahmanical tradition internalized and variously reinterpreted the three Vedic sacrificial fires as concepts such as truth, right, tranquility or restraint. Buddhist texts also refer to the three Vedic sacrificial fires, reinterpreting and explaining them as ethical conduct. The Sramana religions challenged and broke with the Brahmanic tradition on core assumptions such as Atman, soul, self, Brahman, the nature of afterlife. And they rejected the authority of the Vedas and Upanishads. Buddhism was one among several Indian religions that did so. Early Buddhist positions in the Theravada tradition had not established any deities, but were epistemologically cautious rather than directly atheist. Later Buddhist traditions were more influenced by the critique of deities within Hinduism and therefore more committed to a strongly atheist stance. These developments were historic and epistemological as documented in verses from Santideva's Bodhicaryavatara, and supplemented by reference to suttas and jataks from the Pali Canon. Indian Buddhism. The history of Indian Buddhism may be divided into 5 periods: early Buddhism, occasionally called pre-sectarian Buddhism, Nikkaya Buddhism or sectarian Buddhism. The period of the early Buddhist schools, early Mahayana Buddhism, late Mahayana, and the era of Vajrayana or the Tantric age. Pre-sectarian Buddhism. According to Lambert Schmidthausen, pre-sectarian Buddhism is the canonical period prior to the development of different schools with their different positions. The early Buddhist texts include the four principal Pali Nikayas and their parallel agamas found in the Chinese canon, together with the main body of monastic rules, which survive in the various versions of the Patimokkha, Bhowever. These texts were revised over time, and it is unclear what constitutes the earliest layer of Buddhist teachings. One method to obtain information on the oldest core of Buddhism is to compare the oldest extant versions of the Theravadan Pali Canon and other texts. The reliability of the early sources and the possibility to draw out a core of oldest teachings is a matter of dispute. According to Vetter, inconsistencies remain, and other methods must be applied to resolve those inconsistencies. According to Schmidthausen, three positions held by scholars of Buddhism can be distinguished. Stress on the fundamental homogeneity and substantial authenticity of at least a considerable part of the Nikaic materials. Skepticism with regard to the possibility of retrieving the doctrine of earliest Buddhism, cautious optimism in this respect. The core teachings. According to Mitchell, certain basic teachings appear in many places throughout the early texts, which has led most scholars to conclude that Gautam Buddha must have taught something similar to the Four Noble Truths. The Noble Eightfold Path, Nirvana, the Three Marks of Existence, the Five Aggregates, Dependent Origination, Karma and Rebirth. According to N. Ross Rayat, all of these doctrines are shared by the Theravada Pali texts in the Mahasamghika school's Salistamba Sutra. A recent study by Bhikkhu Analayo concludes that the Theravada Majjhima Nikaya and Sarvastivada Madhyama Agama contain mostly the same major doctrines. Richard Salomon, in his study of the Gandharan texts, which are the earliest manuscripts containing early discourses, has confirmed that their teachings are consistent with non-Mahayana Buddhism, which survives today in the Theravada school of Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, but which in ancient times was represented by 18 separate schools. However, some scholars argue that critical analysis reveals discrepancies among the various doctrines found in these early texts, which point to alternative possibilities for early Buddhism. The authenticity of certain teachings and doctrines have been questioned. For example, some scholars think that karma was not central to the teaching of the historical Buddha, while others disagree with this position. Likewise, there is scholarly disagreement on whether insight was seen as liberating in early Buddhism or whether it was a later addition to the practice of the Four Jhanas. Scholars such as Bronkhorst also think that the Four Noble Truths may not have been formulated in earliest Buddhism, and did not serve in earliest Buddhism as a description of liberating insight. According to Vetter, the description of the Buddhist path may initially have been as simple as the term, the middle way. In time, this short description was elaborated, resulting in the description of the Eightfold Path. Ashokan era and the early schools. According to numerous Buddhist scriptures, soon after the parinirvana, from Sanskrit, highest extinguishment, of Gautam Buddha, the first Buddhist council was held to collectively recite the teachings to ensure that no errors occurred in oral transmission. Many modern scholars question the historicity of this event. However, Richard Gombrich states that the monastic assembly recitations of the Buddha's teaching likely began during Buddha's lifetime, and they served a similar role of codifying the teachings. The so-called Second Buddhist Council resulted in the first schism in the Sangha. Modern scholars believe that this was probably caused when a group of reformists called Sthaviras, elders, sought to modify the Vinay, monastic rule. And this caused a split with the conservatives who rejected this change. They were called Mahasamghikas. While most scholars accept that this happened at some point, There is no agreement on the dating, especially if it dates to before or after the reign of Ashoka. Buddhism may have spread only slowly throughout India until the time of the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka, 304–232 BCA, who was a public supporter of the religion. The support of Ashoka and his descendants led to the construction of more stupas, such as at Sanchi and Bharhut. Temples, such as the Mahabodhi temple, and to its spread throughout the Maurya Empire and into neighboring lands such as Central Asia and to the island of Sri Lanka. During and after the Mauryan period, 322–180 BCA, the Sthavira community gave rise to several schools. One of which was the Theravada school, which tended to congregate in the south, and another which was the Sarvastivada school, which was mainly in North India. Likewise, the Mahasamghika groups also eventually split into different sanghas. Originally, these schisms were caused by disputes over monastic disciplinary codes of various fraternities, but eventually, by about 100 CE if not earlier, schisms were being caused by doctrinal disagreements too. Following, or leading up to, the schisms, each Sangha started to accumulate their own version of Tripitaka, triple basket of texts. In their Tripitaka, each school included the suttas of the Buddha, a Vinay basket, disciplinary code, and some schools also added an Abhidharma basket, which were texts on detailed scholastic classification, summary and interpretation of the suttas. The doctrine details in the Abhidharmas of various Buddhist schools differ significantly, and these were composed starting about the 3rd century BCE and through the 1st millennium CE. Post-Ashokan expansion. According to the edicts of Ashoka, the Mauryan emperor sent emissaries to various countries west of India to spread dharma, particularly in eastern provinces of the neighboring Seleucid Empire, and even farther to Hellenistic kingdoms of the Mediterranean. It is a matter of disagreement among scholars whether or not these emissaries were accompanied by Buddhist missionaries in Central and West Asia. Buddhist influence grew through Greek-speaking Buddhist monarchs and ancient Asian trade routes, a phenomenon known as Greco-Buddhism. An example of this is evidenced in Chinese and Pali Buddhist records, such as Milindapana and the Greco-Buddhist art of Gandhara. The Milindapana describes a conversation between a Buddhist monk and the 2nd century BCE Greek king Menander, after which Menander abdicates and himself goes into monastic life in the pursuit of nirvana. Some scholars have questioned the Milindapana version, expressing doubts whether Menander was Buddhist or just favorably disposed to Buddhist monks. The Kushan Empire, 30375 CA, came to control the Silk Road trade through Central and South Asia, which brought them to interact with Gandharan Buddhism and the Buddhist institutions of these regions. The Kushans patronized Buddhism throughout their lands, and many Buddhist centers were built or renovated. The Sarvastivada school was particularly favored, especially by Emperor Kanishka, 128–151 CA. Kushan support helped Buddhism to expand into a world religion through their trade routes. Buddhism spread to Khotan, the Tarim Basin, and China, eventually to other parts of the Far East. Some of the earliest written documents of the Buddhist faith are the Gandharan Buddhist texts, dating from about the 1st century CE, and connected to the Dharmaguptaka school, the Islamic conquest of the Iranian plateau in the 7th century, followed by the Muslim conquests of Afghanistan and the later establishment of the Ghaznavid kingdom with Islam as the state religion in Central Asia between the 10th and 12th century led to the decline and disappearance of Buddhism from most of these regions. Mahayana Buddhism. The origins of Mahayana, Great Vehicle, Buddhism are not well understood, and there are various competing theories about how and where this movement arose. Theories include the idea that it began as various groups venerating certain texts, or that it arose as a strict forest ascetic movement. The first Mahayana works were written sometime between the 1st century BCE and the 2nd century CE. Much of the early extant evidence for the origins of Mahayana comes from early Chinese translations as a certain set of ideals and later doctrines for bodhisattvas. Records written by Chinese monks visiting India indicate that both Mahayana and non-Mahayana monks could be found in the same monasteries, with the difference that Mahayana monks worshipped figures of bodhisattvas, while non-Mahayana monks did not. Mahayana initially seems to have remained a small minority movement that was in tension with other Buddhist groups, struggling for wider acceptance. However, during the 5th and 6th centuries CE, there seems to have been a rapid growth of Mahayana Buddhism, which is shown by a large increase in epigraphic and manuscript evidence in this period. However, it still remained a minority in comparison to other Buddhist schools. Mahayana Buddhist institutions continued to grow in influence during the following centuries, with large monastic university complexes such as Nalanda, established by the 5th century CE Gupta Emperor, Kumaragupta I, and Vikramashila, established under Dharmapal c. 783 to 820, becoming quite powerful and influential. During this period of late Mahayana, 4 major types of thought developed: Madhyamaka, Yogacara, Buddha nature, Tathagatagarbha, and the epistemological tradition of Dignaga and Dhammakirti. According to Dan Lusthaus, Madhyamaka and Yogacara have a great deal in common, and the commonality stems from early Buddhism. Late Indian Buddhism and Tantra during the Gupta period, 4th-6th centuries, and the empire of Harsvardhana, circa 590-647 CA, Buddhism continued to be influential in India, and large Buddhist learning institutions such as Nalanda and Vallabha universities were at their peak. Buddhism also flourished under the support of the Pala Empire, 8th-12th centuries. Under the Guptas and Palas, Tantric Buddhism or Vajrayana developed and rose to prominence. It promoted new practices such as the use of mantras, dharanis, mudras, mandalas and the visualization of deities and Buddhas, and developed a new class of literature, the Buddhist Tantras. This new esoteric form of Buddhism can be traced back to groups of wandering yogi magicians called Mahasiddhas. The question of the origins of early Vajrayana has been taken up by various scholars. David Seyfert Ruegg has suggested that Buddhist Tantra employed various elements of a pan-Indian religious substrate, which is not specifically Buddhist, Shaiva or Vaishnava. According to Indologist Alexis Sanderson, various classes of Vajrayana literature developed as a result of royal courts sponsoring both Buddhism and Saivism. Sanderson has argued that Buddhist Tantras can be shown to have borrowed practices, terms, rituals and more from Shaiva Tantras. He argues that Buddhist texts even directly copied various Shaiva Tantras, especially the Bharva Vidyapitha Tantras. Ronald M. Davidson meanwhile argues that Sanderson's claims for direct influence from Shaiva Vidyapitha texts are problematic because the chronology of the Vidyapitha Tantras is by no means so well established, and that the Shaiva tradition also appropriated non-Hindu deities, texts and traditions. Thus, while there can be no question that the Buddhist Tantras were heavily influenced by Kapalika and other Seva movements, argues Davidson, the influence was apparently mutual. Already during this later era, Buddhism was losing state support in other regions of India, including the lands of the Karkotas, the Pratiharas, the Rashtrakutas, the Pandyas and the Pallavas. This loss of support in favor of Hindu faiths like Vaishnavism and Shivism is the beginning of the long and complex period of the decline of Buddhism in the Indian subcontinent. The Islamic invasions and conquest of India, 10th to 12th century, further damaged and destroyed many Buddhist institutions, leading to its eventual near disappearance from India by the 1200s. Spread to East and Southeast Asia. The Silk Road transmission of Buddhism to China is most commonly thought to have started in the late 2nd or the 1st century CE. Though the literary sources are all open to question. The first documented translation efforts by foreign Buddhist monks in China were in the 2nd century CE. Probably as a consequence of the expansion of the Kushan Empire into the Chinese territory of the Tarim Basin. The first documented Buddhist texts translated into Chinese are those of the Parthian and Shigao, 148-180 c.a. The first known Mahayana scriptural texts are translations into Chinese by the Kushan monk Lokaksema in Luoyang, between 178 and 189 CE. From China, Buddhism was introduced into its neighbors Korea, 4th century, Japan, 6th-7th centuries, and Vietnam, circa 1st-2nd centuries. During the Chinese Tang dynasty, 618 to 907, Chinese esoteric Buddhism was introduced from India and Chan Buddhism, Zen, became a major religion. Chan continued to grow in the Song dynasty, 960-1279, and it was during this era that it strongly influenced Korean Buddhism and Japanese Buddhism. Pure Land Buddhism also became popular during this period and was often practiced together with Chan. It was also during the Song that the entire Chinese canon was printed using over 130,000 wooden printing blocks. During the Indian period of esoteric Buddhism, from the 8th century onwards, Buddhism spread from India to Tibet and Mongolia. Johannes Bronkhorst states that the esoteric form was attractive because it allowed both a secluded monastic community as well as the social rites and rituals important to laypersons and to kings for the maintenance of a political state during succession and wars to resist invasion. During the Middle Ages, Buddhism slowly declined in India, while it vanished from Persia and Central Asia as Islam became the state religion. The Theravada school arrived in Sri Lanka sometime in the 3rd century BCE. Sri Lanka became a base for its later spread to Southeast Asia after the 5th century CE, Myanmar, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Cambodia and coastal Vietnam. Theravada Buddhism was the dominant religion in Burma during the Monhanthawadi Kingdom, 1287 to 1552. It also became dominant in the Khmer Empire during the 13th and 14th centuries and in the Thai Sukhothai Kingdom during the reign of Ram Khamhaeng, 1237–1247 to 1298. Brief history in Buddhism spread beyond India, 3rd century BCE 1st century CE. Emperor Ashoka of the Maurya dynasty played a crucial role in spreading Buddhism across India and beyond through his support of the religion. Buddhist missionaries were sent to various parts of Asia, including Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia. Development of Buddhist texts, 1st century BCE 1st century CE. The Tripitaka, Pali Canon, and Mahayana Sutras were written down during this period, preserving the Buddha's teachings in written form. Expansion into East Asia, 1st century CE 1st millennium CE. Buddhism continued to spread eastward, reaching China, Korea, and Japan. It adapted to local cultures, resulting in Chinese Chan, Zen, Buddhism and Japanese Zen Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism, 7th century CE, Buddhism arrived in Tibet and merged with indigenous Bon beliefs, giving rise to Tibetan Buddhism, characterized by its unique practices and rituals. Decline in India and Southeast Asia, 8th century CE. Over time, Buddhism waned in its land of origin, India, largely due to the resurgence of Hinduism and the Muslim conquests. However, it continued to thrive in Southeast Asia. Revival in India, 20th century. Buddhism experienced a revival in India in the 20th century, led by figures like Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who converted to Buddhism as a form of social protest against the caste system. Global spread, 19th century, present. Buddhism began to spread to the West in the 19th and 20th centuries and has since become a global religion, with followers in centers worldwide. It has also seen a resurgence in some Asian countries, such as Vietnam and Cambodia, following periods of suppression.